you for tuning in to Circling Dialogos and my conversation with Christopher Mastropietro. In this conversation, we're basically discussing the Dialectica de Dialogos course, which is happening relatively shortly, February 4th and 5th. It's February 4th and 5th. The course is all online, 10 a.m. till about 4 p.m., both Saturday and Sunday. And that course is led by John Vervaeke, Christopher, and myself. And in this conversation is a pretty playful, meandering dialogue loosely around the course and the issues around the course. And I hope you really, really enjoy it. And I hope to see you at the course. Thank you so much. So welcome back, my friend. We've just been, of course,
welcome back to you.
For the last half an hour up until this point. But we were saying, you were saying like that for you, the work that you and I are doing with Dialogos and all the things associated with it it's really for you, and I concur that it's really we're doing it from the place of an art. Right?
Yeah.
It's really from an artistic standpoint as a work of art. And that's what kind of makes it what it is for us in a big way.
Yeah, it really does. It reminds me, people have said this before when they've come and done the course, but it shares so much DNA with things like improvisation.
Yeah.
I think it shares DNA with most art forms that I've ever encountered.
Yeah.
In that there is a spontaneous, there's a certain structural component to it that's necessary, right? You put it down like a stencil and you trace through it as a way of practicing technique. But then there's a lot of it that is spontaneous, whose energy is spontaneous, and that requires giving yourself over to a creative instinct.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's interesting and kind of ironic because, the artist and the philosopher have had a very, very, very strange, ambivalent relationship with each other over time, right? Yeah. And of course, given that this practice is modeled after the Socratic tradition, Plato's tradition of dialogues, there's a lot of irony to the fact that the form itself is so artistic, but of course, Plato's treatment of the artist is also very famous.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I love that tension.
Yeah.
And what that tension, I don't know exactly what to do with it, but what that tension suggests to me, and the way that I try and treat this practice and the entire world that the practice takes place inside, is to treat it both very seriously and not seriously at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And somehow both have to be true.
Right.
Seriously in the moment of being caught in the thrall of the process.
Yeah.
You sort of give it everything you have in the moment. Yeah. You take it seriously. You take it upon yourself seriously, and you allow yourself to be taken upon seriously by it.
Yes.
But the minute it's over, you're ready to throw it out.
Yes.
Not to throw out the meaningfulness of the practice and the exercise, but to throw out all of the content.
Yeah.
Like all of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Right.
Totally. It's funny because I remember this is as when I was in art school, and I moved to San Francisco to go to art school at the San Francisco Art Institute, and like I would make these pieces, right, that just fucking took forever and took everything to make. And the moment I was done with them, I was really done with them. Like in some sense it was so much of it was the, and you would think the amount of fucking effort it took to make this, Herculean statue like 10 feet tall and everything. They all that stuff ended up in my friends' backyards, right? And like the paintings got moldy from being out in the garage, and like, I get not every artist has a relationship to their art that way, but there's something explanatory about that. And I think with this inherent in it is this, I think, is what the practice of philosophy kind of calls for on one level. And it's a rare and rare thing, I find, like in the world, right? Which is to really do something as an end in itself.
Yeah.
Right? To really be doing something, right? Not as a means to another end, but as an end in itself, right? Like, and for its own sake, in some sense.
Yes.
And there's something that's exercised just in doing that, right? That feels a lot like art to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Feels a lot like art to me. Because I think on some level, I think that's part of the fire that gets caught, right, with people, is when they do these practices, is because there's an enthrallment with it, right? And in what you're taking up are things that are primordial to life, right? They like things that you can't go any deeper than them at some level, right? And you take them up, and you start to get in touch with that, and you become one with that in some sense in these dialogues, right? and and you literally get this sense of the end, like what are the ends in themselves about life and about existence and about being. And you take these up, and it's absolutely it's like time seals. It's like the only thing that's ever mattered. And then and then afterwards you look back and you're like, what the hell were we talking about? Right? At some level.
Right.
But the thing that carries through is the act of doing that and the practice of doing that, right?
Yes.
Open something up, right?
Yeah.
Open something up in a big, big, big way.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And the very capacity to relate to something so earnestly and so singularly,
Mhm.
focus on it. So like there's a singleness of attention that's required of it. That's hard to come by in, I think, most kinds of activities, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, there is a flow to it, obviously, but there's also a kind of concern toward it, a concern toward what is emerging from it and what it is becoming
Yeah.
as you participate in it, that draws out a kind of singleness of attention.
Mhm.
And then I think the thing that we withdraw from it back into the rest of life, as you say, is not any one thing that is said.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be any one thing that is said.
Yeah.
It is the practice, it's like the postural practice itself of being so absorbed in 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 tracking the unfolding of something
Mhm.
and finding yourself right on the crest of it,
Mhm. Yeah.
and being and having to give yourself over to it,
Yeah.
right? Having to give yourself over to something good, where the thing that's good is not the idea, but it's the shared attention and the faithfulness of the attention,
Yeah. Yeah.
and um and the possibility that comes from the center of that attention,
Yeah.
which is incredible, you know.
Yeah.
But then I think it only works, and the thing that often scares me about this, right? The greatest dangers come from the greatest joys,
Mhm.
right? And the greatest potentials, which is that the experience becomes enthralling enough that whatever is gained from the experience that can be summarized or repeated becomes the fruit of the experience.
Right.
And it's not, right?
No.
It's not.
No.
And thank goodness for that, because it means that we don't have to worry as much about what is said.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because what is said is just it's one of the gestures of it's
yeah.
It's made, everything that's said is a gesture made for the purpose of the form of relatedness, the
Totally.
right. And not said for preservation, And it's odd. And so then the question becomes, well, if it's not said for preservation, then what about all of these instances of its preservation?
Yeah.
And then I think that's a tricky one.
Yeah.
And then I think I might wonder, well, maybe the instances of its preservation are only helpful insofar as they help to trace the path.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. They show an instance of tracing out the practice itself. And then by following it, maybe there's some hope of being able to reproduce that kind of attention.
Yeah.
But not because of any one insight.
Yeah, it's like the matter most worthy of our consideration becomes considered, right? In that moment, right? Of this remembering. And it's very much like this. Like, I think it's very Platonic in that sense of the word, of like, it's a recollecting. It's like remembering. So it's not so much like a going out and discovering something new. It's more like falling back and remembering what you are and who you are, right? And that's the process of discovery, is also the process of remembering and recalling, right? That we are being, right? That we are. And we know very little about what that means, right? And being confronted with and as Heidegger would say, the basic disposition of philosophy, right? I'm reading right now, I'm doing a series on the basic question of philosophy, and it's the first I'm like four videos into it. I think I've like covered like a page and a half of kind of working through this thing. But what he says about this, he's driving home into the disposition for which something like philosophy could arise at all. And he says this here. I can just read this. I'd be interested to hear what you think about this. This first, I got it right here. Let's see. Let me pull this out. I'll read you the first paragraph and the third paragraph because it gets hold of this. He says, like, he starts off, he's like, the basic question of philosophy, quote unquote. That seems to imply there is such a thing as philosophy in itself, from whose domain basic questions could be drawn out. But such is not the case and cannot be. On the contrary, it is only the very asking of the basic questions that first determines what philosophy is. Since that is the case, since that is so, we need to indicate in advance how philosophy will reveal itself when we question, i.e., if we invest everything without exception, in this questioning and do not merely act as if we were questioning while still believing we possessed our reputed truths.
Oh,
right.
Yeah.
So there's that quality, right, of like investing everything.
Yeah.
On one level that kind of demarcates the investment of everything, demarcates absolute significance, right? Letting go of everything, right? And being open to it. But also
willing one thing and one thing alone.
But it also is an emptying at the same time, right? it's a complete emptying and unfolding and all the way getting down to the nub of yourself. So there's this kind of double sense to that, right? To let go of everything leaves you with nothing, right? So it's like it's got this kind of is this deep significance and this absolute negativity to it at the same time, right? Which I think is held in tension there. And also that sense about like that sense of like philosophy not being something um out there independent of the inquiry that you can ask questions about, right? But like if there's something about taking on, and I know from Heidegger's standpoint, taking on, we are that being whose being is a question for us, right? So to really ask the question is synonymous for Heidegger with being a human being, right? In the fullest sense, right? So when you really ask the question, everything's at stake in the matter because you're implicated all the way down, right? In that way. And then he goes on, and here's the one more paragraph down. And this is where he starts to talk about, and I'd love to hear what you think about this part. He says, if we had to say something immediately about the basic disposition of philosophy, i.e., a futural philosophy, we might call it restraint. In it, two elements originally belong together and are as one. The first being terror in the face of what is closest and most obtrusive, namely, that beings are. And secondly, awe in the face of what is remotest, namely, that in beings and before each being holds sway. Restraint is the here's the interesting part here. Restraint is the disposition in which this terror is not overcome and set aside, but is precisely preserved and conserved through awe. Restraint is the basic disposition of the relation to being, and in it, the concealment of the essence of being becomes what is most worthy of questioning. Only one who throws himself in the all-consuming fire of the questioning of what is most worthy of questioning has the right to say more of the basic disposition that disposition than is elusive than its elusive name. Yet once he has wrestled for himself this right, he will not employ it, but will keep silent. For all the more reason, the basic disposition should never become an object of mere talk. For example, in the popular and rash claim that we are now teaching is a philosophy of restraint. So to summarize, like he's basically saying there's there is no philosophy without being in a disposition, right? Like, so when I think of a disposition, and he's countering it to this kind of normal way of thinking about philosophers as somehow stepping back outside of everything, right? He's talking about, no, it's a stepping into something, right? It's like a disposition is kind of like something like the organizing relationship of your embodied embeddedness in the world, something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And so he's saying that really philosophy, in the real sense of the word, arises in and through this kind of questioning, which is provided and given by this basic disposition, right? Mm-hmm. And then he says, and that disposition is one of restraint, and restraint being one of two elements of terror and of awe. Terror,
Terror, like
terror.
terror, like
Yeah,
okay, like
yeah,
Teorror.
yeah.
Okay.
Right. Terror and of awe. Right. Terror being kind of this recognition that what you are being, right, is the closest thing to you, but the most obscure, right?
Yeah.
And then awe in that being holds sway over everything, but yet never shows itself as a being, right? And that disposition is both the conservation and the preservation of those two elements. Which, if you can hold those two elements in your being, in terror and in awe, in that position of constraint, that which is concealed can become questionable, right? That which is withdrawing can become something that can come forward and be questioned and shine in some sense, right? Or the question for Heidegger, the question of being.
Oh baby.
And I sense like there's something about that. Like when I think about the ecology of practice is layered in the course, right? And I think about it in terms of like attuning to a basic disposition, right? Of these elements of terror and awe, right? Not necessarily.
Where is the terror? I'm not saying there isn't.
Yeah.
I think there is, but where would you say the terror is in the practices?
It's in the it's something like it's when the most familiar kind of shows itself as uncanny,
Right.
right? Like it's that
Right.
place it's that place where like when you're a kid and you're like kind of come to, and all of a sudden you get some slice of it could be some fucking other way, but it's this way. In the
Right.
arbitrariness of it,
Right.
right?
Right.
That really close in thing that you
Right.
find yourself in is actually the thing that's uncannily weird.
Right.
That's the attunement mood that he's, I think, referring to.
Hmm.
And in some sense, like for example, in meditation, in mindfulness, I mean, what else is mindfulness other than like looking closer and closer and closer in, right? And abiding into what's
What is?
what is, right? And in some sense, it's kind of like a meditation is in some sense is heading right in the direction of that recognition,
Right. Right.
right? And then the
Right.
philosophical contemplation, the next one that John walks you through, is this in some sense trying to see. It's like the terror is something like if being were like a beach ball, the tear is something like the view from within the beach ball of being, and the awe would be the view of the beach ball from outside of it, right? In some
Right.
sense,
Right.
it's back and forth.
So the awe is like the awe. So the awe has something to do with the marvel that what is at all.
Mhm.
And the terror has something to do with your being so implicated in what is.
Yep.
Because what is your having to be it.
Yes. And yet,
You're
yes,
being a being of it,
yes,
right?
yes.
So one of the things, okay, so let me see if I've understood you and riff a little bit. I think what I'm hearing is that like so one of the things that happens in some of these practices, and I think it happens during circling and it happens during Dialogos in very different ways,
Mhm.
which is that you get a whiff of the kind of person that you are.
Yeah. Right.
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
It's terrifying to realize that you are the kind of person that you are, and to realize that there is some immutability there.
Yeah.
Right. That's one of the great tensions of the whole existential tradition is the thrownness, right? That you are already.
Yeah.
And that you can't help but be as you are. And a huge amount of our existential effort is neurotically spent trying to rid ourselves of what we are.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a huge amount of our neurotic effort is trying to assume ourselves as we are. And somehow they often feel like movements in the same direction.
Totally.
Away and toward end up being movements in the same direction. Because both involve seeking out something that is other than what is here now.
Right.
Clearly.
Right.
Right. And that's despair and that right. So the terror is something like the realization.
Yeah.
And the despair is the response to the realization. Yeah. And the terror can present itself in these practices because you're forced to reckon with yourself through an eye that is at the center, that is not you per se. And you see yourself from a center of perspective that beholds you as a part of what is.
Yeah.
Right. And maybe that's really interesting. So then maybe one of the things that this practice or these practices right down to and back to their origin are trying to do is to properly fuse the combination together, which is to say the awe of beholding the beach ball from a distance in the sand.
Yes.
And being within the beach ball and having a bifocal awareness that somehow includes both the felt existential and subjective disposition of being inside the beach ball. And to be the eye beholding the beach ball and to somehow have those in tension at once in such a way that the thing that is concealed can become the center of the attention, held in the tension between those two things.
And that thing that is concealed, that can glow, or concealment or withdrawal itself can start to show itself, right? And start to be held open, if you will, right? Through questioning and looking, is that thing that you are, right?
Right.
And that thing that you are, because if you think about it from the existential point of view, it's a mystery. From the view from looking outside of it, it's a mystery on both ends, right?
Yeah, it is a mystery on both. Oh, so what's between the mysteries?
Yeah. And there's something about holding both ends of the mysteries that afford something else to arise that's usually covered over. And
what is the thing arising?
I think it's something that can't be an object.
Yeah. Right.
It's something non-subject to object related, but it's a disclosure of some kind.
It's something like attention itself.
Yeah.
Right? Or intelligibility itself. There's you're right. It's not an object. It's not a thing being disclosed.
Yeah. But it's revealed in the mood of terror or anxiety.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That way that anxiety is that kind of experience of fear without an object, right? And in wonder of that which is most familiar to you reveals its sheer extraordinariness, right? Its sheer incomprehensibleness that there's anything at all. And so being itself is are these two dimensions, and somehow holding that disposition and both conserving it and preserving it, right? Not demanding that it be immediately intelligible, right? And not covering it over and getting rid of it, but holding that in the basic disposition.
Right.
And I think John brought up a good point. When I talked with him about this, because I read this to him a couple days ago in our conversation, and he's like, well, this is what I have a hard time with Heidegger, right? He's like, where are the virtues in this, right? Like I want something, I don't want just want dispositions. I want, I think he said that, something like that, right? Like I want that
He
what
said, where are
calls,
the virtues?
yeah. And I've thought about that since then. And I'm like, well, it seems like there's virtues within this, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, okay. So that's a good question. So where are the virtues? Well, how do you hold those two things, those two dispositions
I I
in
think it's
tension with one another, except in relation to a virtue?
yeah, yeah,
Is
exactly.
virtue the very thing? Is virtue that very identity that by assuming it, you're actually able to come into a relation with both of those dispositions at once?
That's why I think it's well, there's courage, right? Definitely. In fact, he calls on courage right off the bat, right in the first paragraph.
Oh,
Invest
does
everything.
he?
Yeah, right. Invest everything. And but I think what another word for this disposition could be reverence,
Yeah.
because reverence has that quality of being before the numinous, and
Yeah.
but yet there's something that gives the numinous affords a right sizedness,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
It's your humbleness before it is the drawing you nearer to it, right? The nearer you are to it, the more humble you become, right? The closer you are to it. It's got that quality to it. I think I think there's reverence implicit in this.
Right.
And
Right.
that, if you look at it from that angle, if there's anything that people experience at the end of that weekend, it's fucking reverence, right?
Yeah. 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 There's a very religious attitude that
Yeah,
in the proper broader sense of the term,
yeah,
there's a religious attitude that emerges. So, and that makes a lot of sense because if you think of what the proposed religious response is to the state of being caught
yeah,
beside yourself, what's the proposed response? The proposed response is faith, which is something like,
yeah,
which is something like accepting, allowing, acquiescing to, I don't know, some kind of willing receipt
yeah,
of the tension
yeah.
between the awe and the anxiety. And
Right,
that, I mean, that's what the Christians call fear of the Lord, right?
right, right. And
Fear of fear of the Lord. I mean, as I understand it, I
yeah,
probably have it wrong, but my understanding is fear of the Lord is something like that. It is like it comes from the dawning anxiety from the fact that because you're not identical to yourself, you're capable of falling away at
yeah,
any given moment
right,
from being in relation to
right,
the source of that awe.
right.
And it comes from I'm losing it even as I'm even it's like slipping back through my fingers. It's gone. But
Right.
I think it has something to do with the uh boy. There's this okay, to completely segue away from that. There's a in mid sentence. There's this. I'm just gonna pull the escape
Yeah,
hatch.
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
lost the thread, but that's fine. Let it trail.
Right.
So, um, there's a title when you were for first reading the passage.
Mhm.
The first thing that came to mind was a there's a title of a philosophy paper. It's a pretty well-known paper. Like a lot of undergraduates read it. Derek Parfit is the author. And the title, I read the paper years ago. I don't remember it, which is no reflection on the paper. My memory's bad. But the only thing I remember about it was its title. And I think it's probably the best title to a paper I've ever read, which is the title is Why Anything? Why This?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
And when I think of that title again, I wonder what it's like. I wonder what it's like to live inside that title and in both parts of it. And when I hear those two questions, they're paired together. The questions go 2 by 2, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a question, they go 2 by 2. So why anything? Why this? And you're describing the two aspects of the beach ball, the aspect seen from without, from the eye of the beach, and the aspect seen from within the ball itself. And it's like those two questions map over those alternating perspectives.
Totally.
Right? Why should there be anything here?
Yeah. And then why this?
Why should this be here? And the question is like the only response to the question is absurd. It's absurdity. It's absurd. It's absolute absurdity. There is no accounting for it. I mean, like you can account for it causally, maybe, but that's not what I mean. Of course, I mean existentially accounting for it, phenomenologically accounting for it.
Yeah.
And you live within a disposition that accounts for it.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine. I can't imagine that except by an attitude taken to its absurdity.
Yeah.
That where the absurdity elicits is what elicits the reverence. Yeah. But the absurdity can only elicit the reverence. Okay, here's something I think this is what I was trying to get at.
Yeah.
Absurdity can only elicit a reverential response, I think, if it has some connection to awe, right? Because otherwise there would be nothing in it to There would not be nothing in it to value, instinctively to value. There would be nothing about absurdity to value instinctively if there wasn't beauty. Beauty is the key. Beauty to me is the missing agent here.
Yeah.
And the awe is, I think, drawn forth by attention to beauty. And if the absurdity of why this, if the absurdity of why am I me and not someone else and not something else and not somewhere else, the absurdity to that can only produce awe, I think, if it's drawn along a form of beauty.
Right.
Of some.
Right. In fact, even that it's a drawing question at all probably is by virtue of it being beautiful.
Right.
In some sense. That it even becomes a question at all with any valence.
Right.
Right.
Right. And that's back to where you started, where you started with Heidegger, which is that somehow the asking of the question is the assuming of the disposition if the question is asked with a kind of with a singleness, with like an absolute oneness of attention. And not asked as if. But although I wonder sometimes whether practicing the question as if gets us closer to being able to ask it in earnest. I don't know. I mean, I hope so, because that's part of what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And there's also something that you brought in there about faith, right? That there is something about like, it's funny. There's a lot in there. It's like there's beauty in there. It seems like there's love in there, right?
Oh yeah.
It seems like there's got to be, in some sense, beauty and love, right? Or have got to be in there to even bother asking the question and bother being interested, right? In some sense, right? Especially if you're going to give everything to it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Something.
Yeah. Right. And in that sense, there is also that erotic sense, right? Of like, this is, if anything that I've gotten from engaging in this stuff, right, for years, like it's helped me kind of develop that sense of that thing that withdraws and shines as it withdraws or something. That thing that's like just out of the corner of your eye that seems, when you see it, it's, you can't you can't grasp it, but there's something about it that's kind of most determining of where you are, right? Just that
Yeah.
scent of that receding horizon of some kind, right? As being
Right.
somehow the most constituting of what is worth loving, right?
Yeah. Like the imagination of which you're a figment.
Yeah. Yes. Very small figment. Yes.
Very small figment. You just find yourself being a figment.
Yes.
I
Yes.
find it all the time.
So the yeah, so that kind of, in some sense, I kind of just, when I was reading through that, I was just trying that on through what we were doing in the course, right? Is this progressive? And you do get that sense, especially like in the circling too, is there's, for some people who have never really done something like circling, right? Or had this in any of their relationships, it's shockingly, it could be shockingly confronting, right? To, in some sense, kind of like face another person and have the structure of what you're practicing inhibit normal, any automaticity,
Yeah.
right? Any social, like social niceties, and where you just are given an instruction just to like hold in one mode and say, like, for example, being with you I notice, or being with you I feel, or where you restrain all of the automaticities of normal relating, and just that moment of facing somebody, with both of you not doing that, there is this kind of strange, there can be this very strange confrontation with something really uncanny,
Mhm.
of that kind of finding yourself being,
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
uh,
Tell me
you,
about it.
you didn't get it.
That's what I figured.
But this, there's something about the what that confronts, and I think it's something like that terror, right? Because in somehow you see in the other person this, um you see yourself in front of this other person,
Mhm.
right, with no way of relieving that tension, and it kind of pulls you back in this kind of sense of awkwardness that you realize that you feel all the time,
Yeah.
but yet is released in all these different ways. And you stay in front of another person that intensifies that feeling, right? And then you find yourselves in the dialogue in another mode, right? And it's usually, what ends up happening is that there's this kind of huge opening, or can be this like huge opening or recognition or realization of being kind of seen or heard in some way, or connected with the other person in some way, in which you
Yeah.
realize afterwards that much of your automatic ways of talking and stuff is actually moving you away from that kind of connection. But there's some kind of existential kind of confrontation that you have to encounter, that you have, right, with this fundamental awkwardness of being human.
Uh, right. And I think the thing that's at the bottom of all of those pauses, the thing that's there that all of the niceties and all of the discursive maneuvers are trying to get away from is that very thing that's immutable.
Yeah.
Right? The thing that can't become anything else.
Yeah. Yeah.
The thing that is and that can't become anything else. I don't mean a particular dilemma or a particular problem or a particular, like, no, but there's something that we are,
yep,
that we can't not be, and we spend most of our time not being.
Yeah. Right.
And that thing is a terror.
Yeah.
And I think that thing is what you're trying to hold in place.
Yeah.
And we'll fight any which way we possibly can.
Yeah.
To not be forced with what cannot be otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And it's no wonder there's so much anxiety that attends to it, because the thing that we are that can't be otherwise is also the thing that causes us to constantly be in error all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's both the thing that can't be otherwise. It's also the thing that causes us to constantly be otherwise.
Yeah.
Because of our movement away from it.
Yeah.
Which the whole, right? It's
yeah.
We're so strange. Yeah. And that's the thing that's always withdrawing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The thing that we are inmost that can't be otherwise, and the thing that every movement tends away from.
Yeah. Yeah.
Therefore, it's the source of everything that's real, and it's also the source of everything that's wrong.
Yeah.
Wrong in the sense of it's the source of all of all of this, of all of the avoidant movements away from the center.
Totally. And what's so strange about being that which you can't not otherwise be, but are that which is thrown to not be it, is that you kind of, it's like that which you most are is somehow what you find yourself being. It's this kind of weird sense. That which you most are is what you find yourself being. Because you would think like that which you most are is somehow something that you push forward, right?
Right.
But that which you most are is the very thing that you find yourself already always being, right?
Right.
And that you find yourself being that which you most are. And that's just a strange thing to think about, like finding yourself being what you inevitably could never be anything other than that, right? That's the uncanniness of the whole thing.
Right.
And there's something about why I think there's something about this is this other component to it, where relationship comes into view, right? Because there's something about like when someone else kind of can gaze where you feel seen in that very place, in that moment of your own finding, and you simultaneously are found.
Mm-hmm.
And it's with an openness, right? With a kindness. There is something so findful, right?
There's a findfulness.
Becomes full of find, right?
It's all about findfulness.
Yes.
It's a new word for the course.
Yes.
That helped me. So, but that's a really good point, because that's why. So what is it? What is it that helps, that calms the anxiety that is our relationship toward the thing that is, that can't be otherwise, but that we spend all of our time trying to make other than it is? And that relationship is characterized by anxiety, which is an always being other than we are, and therefore always being in error, and therefore always being in despair. And so then what is it that repairs, it's not right, because that suggests a brokenness, which I think is right, but it's the wrong metaphor. It's sort of like, what is it that draws us back into train with what is about ourselves? And it is the regard.
Yeah.
It is the knowing, comprehending regard that comes from without.
Yeah.
And it's the solicitous love.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the comprehending love.
Yeah.
That knows, that sees precisely whether not in a sense that it can articulate it, because this is not something that's, I think this is unspeakable.
Yeah.
But it's that regard that in the relationship between two people, or more, but I think I still think it has to begin with two. I don't know. Maybe that's something we can talk about.
Yeah, totally.
But it's that which brings you back together as being that which you are. Yeah. And being brought back together as that which you are somehow only happens when that which you are is held.
Yeah.
Is beheld.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
And is beheld in such a way that it becomes necessary for something else to be real at the same time.
And I think you're right. It is a non-propositional holding.
It's totally a non-propositional holding.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. It's definitely, yeah. But that's why people when people have relationships in which they're very loved, any kind of relationship, it's like they're made themselves again,
right,
by those relationships.
And to the degree that that's not happening in the relationship is to the degree that it's there are problems in the relationship, right?
And that's right, because then conversely, that's why someone can be totally and utterly destroyed by a relationship too.
Yep.
Because it's the same power, the same force, if it's acting in exactly the opposite fashion.
Yeah.
Then nothing could do more to scatter you and drive you away from that which you are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Than someone who beholds you and wants you apart.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Right. Or something like that.
Totally. And there's something about it too, because it's like, it strikes me as something, there's another, in some sense, it exemplifies the very challenge itself too, because it's like there's an holding of that which you could not be otherwise, which is, I love you. If I say I love you, and that love, if it's total, it's going to be totally of you, that which you cannot otherwise be, right? Mm-hmm. Yet that very holding, there's a reciprocity of a response to that, right? That is, I would say, is a coming out, right, of that which I couldn't otherwise be, like a responsiveness back, right? That responsive back is somehow becoming even more than myself, than
right. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So there's this kind of sense where it just doesn't hold it in stasis, right? But it's a dynamic of interplay.
That's right. No, that's right. Because it's not. That's right. Because it's not as though there's something that's fixed, that's beheld, and then made whole and unchanging. It's not like that. You're right. It's like the very act of beholding it is what draws it forth, and draws forth the thing about it that's inexhaustible. So the becoming of that which it is not like you don't get to a point and rest there.
Yeah.
That would be exactly the wrong way of thinking about it.
Absolutely.
No. That being, it's like coming into stride with being that which you are is exactly the process of unfolding.
Yes.
And it's something that must be renewed every single instant.
Yeah.
You don't do it and then it's done.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is true of all of these things, isn't it? Right? You don't do it. You don't have a dialogos and it's like, great, we got there.
Yes.
Let's all go home. It's like,
Right.
no, it doesn't, because you throw it out the second it's finished. And so you renew it.
Yes.
Every moment.
Yes. It's deeply ecstatically temporal.
Right. Deeply ecstatically temporal. And the minute it stops being deeply ecstatically temporal is the minute it becomes something that it cannot be.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the kind of weird thing. That's that weird thing about, like, I think that's, I mean, there's a lot, I know a big part of, I think, authenticity in kind of the existential sense is precisely the overcoming of taking yourself as a thing, right? Or a kind of entity of some kind, like a spatial entity in some representational way. And it's something about, it's precisely this, and I think we're finding it in this conversation, this place where we can't kind of hold it still, right? Like it does, it's dynamical. It throws itself out from itself and finding itself, but the other calls it forward, and it's this movement of dynamism, right? Is the thing that lets you be able to let it go. And it is that movement of dynamism that the symbol of the dialogue enacts, right? The symbol of the dialogue is in some sense this kind of de-thinging of ourselves, right? In this way, right? Like this opening up and having ideas that you wouldn't have otherwise, right? Becoming beyond yourself. This kind of decentering of your thinghood, some way.
The decentering of your thinghood,
in the best sense.
A decentering of your, a decentering of your faithhood, a decentering of your thinghood in the spirit of your findfulness. See, we can write Heidegger.
Absolutely, right? Yes. This is like very academic philosophy that we're coming.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm sure they would. Yeah. They would approve. One of the things that I just right, like circling back all the way to where we started in this conversation, which is the sense of play that we have to have about this stuff.
Yeah.
And all of the ways it must be taken seriously and all the ways it must not be. And this is a very good example of the way in which it must not be, which is that there's so much tumbling.
Yeah.
There's so much clumsiness. There's so much error in all of this. And it's all necessary, much of it, at least. And it's certainly one of the things I have learned. Like one of the things in doing this, one of the things I think I've had to come to grips with far more than I ever did or thought possible was just to find quality almost in the Persigian sense, to find a quality to being an error, and to find a quality in just the constantly falling over it.
Yeah.
And to understand that as a feature of the process, and to understand it as long as it's being guided by the proper kind of attention. And it can easily not be, but if it is, and there's a certain amount of there's the right kind of playfulness, the right kind of artist's playfulness that attends to it, then it's all still in service of the good. And I spend a lot of time thinking about this. I spend a lot of time thinking about it and thinking about the dangers of bullshit in the whole process. And you know, because we just play with a lot of things and constantly, and sometimes I think we're really onto something, and then sometimes I find myself just veering way off into the abyss and having to like crawl back. And I wonder and I worry sometimes about the dangers of bullshit creeping into that kind of playfulness. But then I think as long as it's all held together with the right kind of attention and spirit, as long as we're willing to talk, like I said, as long as we're willing to keep the spirit of relation,
right,
to keep the relatedness, to keep this whatever it is that magnetizes the attention to it, but to throw everything else out over our shoulder and begin again every single time, then I know we're okay.
Totally.
So long as we're able to do that, I know we're okay.
Totally.
And it's so important that we keep that. And I have to remind myself of it. I have to remind myself not to vest it with the wrong kind of not just to vest it appropriately, you know.
Yeah, totally. So you got that sense of like the constraints of the practice, right, are one of the things that holds, I think, that together, because it's that as I was reminded of in John's his recent conversation with Jordan Peterson, where he went over that whole thing about the way the brain works. It seems to be this kind of like this focus, and then this relaxation or this openness that lets in noise, and then this focus, right, to reorganize, which updates this thing. It's constantly doing this back and forth, right? This focus. And it was good making noise with you.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's always good.
Always good making noise with you.
I don't care what it amounts to. I just enjoy doing it. That's it.
Absolutely.
That's enough. That's enough.
All right.
So we got the course coming up.
Yep. We got the 4th and 5th. 4th and 5th, Saturday and Sunday, 10 a.m. till 4 p.m. approximately. Standard time.
February 4th and 5th to be.
February 4th and 5th. Starting off at 10 a.m. and layers of practice that go all the way up in the culminating practice of dialectic into Dialogos. And all of it's experiential. There's very, very little, there's almost no lecturing. It's just setting you up for each exercise and then answering questions afterwards and some discussion in between, or then right back into practice. It's really it ends up being a very reverential, celebratory event. Is very, very much so. And the people that it draws in have been wonderful and really enjoyable.
Really, very, very impressive and very open-minded and open-hearted people. Very insightful. And I think the thing we always say, but it's important to keep emphasizing it, is that this is something that is still coming together.
Yes.
You know, it's still coming together. It's still very fresh.
Yes.
Obviously there are ingredients in it that are remarkably ancient.
Yes.
But in this particular gathering of it, it's remarkably new too. So there's something about that has a certain charge. Mm-hmm. So people are coming not just to get something rote, but to participate in the unfolding of something that doesn't quite have a destination, but certainly has an orientation.
Ditto.
Yeah.
All right, my friend. Good talking with you.
Always.
As always. All right. Goodbye, everybody.